Thomas Green here with the Peaceful Parenting Podcast. On the episode today, we have Jake Morgan. Hello, Jake.
Hello.
And a special guest by the name of Rachel Bailey. Rachel, welcome.
Hi, thank you.
Would you like to take a moment and tell the audience a bit about yourself and what you do?
Sure. So I am what I call a parenting specialist. So it's very similar to a parenting coach, but my background's in clinical psychology. And I'm going to be very honest that I don't just coach parents. I do more of consulting and advising. That's why I don't call myself a coach. But generally, my goal is to help parents, to give them practical tools for raising a more peaceful, a more connected home, for fostering better moods, behavior, and attitudes in the home, not just in the kids, but in us as parents as well. But I just will say that I'm a mom as well, and I'm not a perfect mom. So I use a lot of strategies that kind of assume parents are also not perfect, dealing with a lot of things.
Well, part of your profile tends to, correct me if I'm wrong, highlight helping with kids with big emotions. So, and I think every parent has, I don't know, that instance where perhaps you could help them with some strategies, as you say. When that, what springs to mind for you there when I raised that?
So yeah, that is where what I specialize in is raising children with big emotions. You know, those kids who have, they go from 0 to 60 without provocation. They tend to be a little less flexible. They may be a little controlling and bossy. They're also really passionate and really loving, but there can be a lot of drama when you're raising kids with big emotions. So really what I always feel that raising kids with big emotions, one of the first things that pops in my head is misunderstanding. Big emotion kids seem like they're being strong-willed, or they seem like they're being selfish sometimes. And really what's happening when you see these dramatic behaviors that we tend not to love is that they're protecting themselves. They do feel things really strongly, and they don't necessarily know how to cope with those feelings. So their behavior sometimes seems a little self-centered. It seems very disruptive, but truly it's a sign that they're struggling.
So being a clinical psychologist, it makes me think that maybe you can get behind that surface level reason as to why that's happening. So, because most parents would look at it and say, well, they just want this or they want that. But obviously you perhaps know a little bit more. So what are the reasons, the real reasons why that big emotion is coming out?
I love that question because it's such an important one. We do have to ask what is beneath that behavior. So since I am a psychologist, I'll talk a little bit of science. So basically, if we think about the way the brain works, there is a part of the brain that allows us to be thoughtful and flexible and handle our emotions maturely. That part of the brain is called the prefrontal cortex. It's located in the front part of the brain. What happens is whenever any human senses some sort of discomfort, and it could be small discomfort, like we're hungry or we're tired. It could be something bigger, like we're feeling out of control or overwhelmed or stressed. Whenever our brain senses that discomfort, I actually call it yuck. Whenever our brain senses yuck, it interprets it as a threat. So it turns on an alarm, and that alarm is our fight or flight response. Now, sensitive people, and I happen to be one of them, I'm actually a highly sensitive person raising 2 sensitive children. When a sensitive person, they feel yuck or they feel discomfort actually more quickly, and they feel it more strongly. So just know that if you have a big emotion child, they aren't necessarily acting disproportionately. They're acting in proportion to how they experience something. So again, they feel this yuck. Their fight or flight response kicks in. And one of the things our fight or flight response does is it shuts off our ability to access that rational, emotional regulation, mature part of the brain. So what you see in their behavior, their inflexibility, their demanding, their blaming, their, even they sometimes turn yuck in on themselves and say, no one likes me, or you're always mad at me, or why are you nicer to my brother or sister? All of these behaviors are symptoms that they're actually in yuck, they're struggling, they're in fight or flight. These are what I call yuck behaviors. So what we really need to understand is when we see these behaviors, it's a sign that they can't access that prefrontal cortex, which, last thing I'll say, by the way, the prefrontal cortex does not fully develop until we're in our mid-20s. So children don't even have a fully developed prefrontal cortex, but when they're feeling these things strongly, they can't access it. And all that you see in their behavior are simply symptoms. So I hope that answers your question.
It definitely does, yeah. I've heard it said many times that, well, I've even said it myself, I think, that children's brains don't fully develop until their mid-20s, but it's more specific to be
The
it's the
prefrontal
prefrontal cortex.
Yeah.
And just following up on what you said, if that is the case, that's highlighting the problem and diagnosing the issue. What's the solution?
Good question. The solution is twofold, I'd say, because there are things we can do in the moment, but there are also things we can do proactively. So this is really what I teach. In the moment, once someone's in fight or flight, it's actually very hard to get them out of it. So I describe yuck as when it's happening in the moment. I use a rainbow shaped curve. I call this the yuck curve. So you can imagine when anyone, this is a child or an adult, when they go into yuck, maybe your child is upset because you told them they couldn't have their blue shirt, something small. But their yuck gets bigger and bigger and bigger. It reaches a peak and it comes down. Now, at the peak is when you're seeing the worst behavior. That's when they're being the most rude, disrespectful, inflexible. Once they're on this curve, it's actually very hard to get them off because we're actually wired to complete the curve. And what we tend to do as parents is we tend to stop our kids. We tend to say, you can't talk to me like that, or that's not acceptable, or stop being so dramatic. And we try to stop our kids. And what that does is it actually puts them deeper into yuck, and their feelings and their behaviors get bigger. So in the moment, dealing with yuck is actually not that much fun. And I always tell people that try not to have to deal with this as much in the moment. But when you do, what you ultimately need to do is to help them, believe it or not, feel safe, which allows them to travel the curve more quickly. And that will end this negative behavior more quickly. So I always say to parents, what happens after your child travels the curve? What's their behavior like? And at that point, they're sweet and they're apologetic because we've let them travel the curve. So what we do about it in the moment, very honestly, is not that much. We need to show them we're sort of on their side versus against them, saying something like, wow, you're really mad that I couldn't give you that blue shirt. Or for some kids, you just really stay quiet. You let them travel the curve, and that's when you engage. So in the moment is not that easy. So I teach a lot of proactive strategies as well to reduce the drama to begin with.
I like
Wow,
that
that's really
terminology.
interesting.
Go ahead, Jake.
Sorry. I was just going to say that makes total sense, because if they're, as you say, if they're up here in the curve, trying to sort of rationalize anything or sort of have a sensible, they have to come down. You can't just pull them down. And very often, in my experience anyway, you see them sort of grow, and the curve you can by trying to interact with them at that stage and sort of use rationality to sort of bring them back to sort of normality. They just seem to get more and more, and they can sort of go introspective even and sort of build up even more. So yeah,
that's exactly
keeping
right.
them safe.
Exactly. And what actually increases yuck is a perception of a threat, which makes sense because if we're in fight or flight, our fight or flight response is saying, am I safe? Can I stop this response? But if a child perceives exactly what you said, that a parent is trying to calm them down or telling them why they're wrong or their behavior is not okay, that's a perception of a threat. And so they get more upset, and the fight or flight response is like, oh no, I can't stop. I need to actually, emote more, or I need to, be upset at myself more. Yep.
So how do you make them feel safe then?
So it depends on the child. Some children, feel safe when we're just present. Some children, I will tell you this, I just did an episode on my own podcast about this. I'd love to share it with you, that some children, when we're calm, we always hear, stay calm as a parent. Some children, when we're calm, it actually makes them more upset because they're feeling things so strongly. So again, you told a child they couldn't have their blue shirt. And in their mind, oh my gosh, I can't have the blue shirt. All my friends are going to be wearing the blue shirt. Everybody in the school is going to notice that I'm wearing a red shirt. This is awful. So they're like all worked up, and we're saying, but the blue shirt is in the laundry, honey. And we're really calm. That is a perception of a threat. So you really have to start to understand your child a little bit. And what is it that does make them feel safe? Do they need to feel heard? Do they need you to just be quiet? Do they need a hug? Do they need someone to squeeze them? So it actually depends on the child.
Yeah, that makes
Mind
sense.
clarifying how this differs based on age? Because immediately what I think of regarding this topic is that the younger tantrums are actually the same thing, and later on when they're older, you still go into fight or flight when you're older. It's just maybe slightly different. So have you got any thoughts there?
Yeah, absolutely. It looks a little different, but you're so right that it's the same thing. It's fight or flight. And our response to fight or flight, our coping mechanisms may change slightly. So younger kids may tend to be the more of the big meltdowns, and aggression tends to be younger kids. So they may grow out of hitting or, kicking or pushing, but then it becomes more verbal, perhaps. You're so awful and I hate you. And kids start to learn what pushes our buttons. And the truth is that when they're hurting, they want us to hurt. So they want to figure out what upsets us. So it may become more verbal. The other thing that adds when kids get older, and this starts at about age 7 or 8, I would say, is that kids start to build up this yuck and they start to numb. And as adults, we numb our yuck all the time. So kids may start to turn to sugar or devices to, find a space where they feel good because they have so much yuck that's built up inside. As adults, we do the same thing. We turn to our devices or sugar or alcohol or whatever we're using. But that starts when kids get a little bit older, and then certainly through teenage years and adulthood, we start to numb. So it definitely does look different, but I'm so glad you realized it's really all the same thing.
Have you given any thought to, or is it in the field of what you study? I've heard the term the pattern interrupt. And to give you an example, like you can be in the middle of fight or flight, and then let's say the phone rings and someone puts on a completely different air, like they break out of that particular cycle that they're in. Did you cover any of that, or does that anything?
I don't research that. I can comment on it based on what I understand of the fight or flight response, but this is just this is an educated theory. So I do not study that though. But what I would say, because I do talk a lot about emotional regulation, is that as soon as your brain realizes you're safe, it can quote unquote snap out of it. So if the phone rings, your brain is realizing, oh, you know what, I'm not actually being chased by a tiger. I'm actually okay. And it can redirect your attention to something. And that's actually how I teach a lot of people to get out of fight or flight, is focus your attention on safety. So when we can interrupt that pattern of this, oh my gosh, this is so awful, the pattern of the threat, then we can snap out of it. The only thing I will always caution is, because a lot of parents will use that to say, well, I should distract my child then. The only thing I would caution is that once someone is in fight or flight, we sort of have to complete our stress response. A buildup of stress that is not completed can actually start to add up. So I wouldn't want to encourage parents to necessarily try to distract their kids. If they distract them in the moment, you need to go back and make sure that the stressor is addressed. Otherwise, all that happens is yuck is built up inside. Does that make sense? Makes
a lot of sense. Particularly like the realizing you're not actually being chased by a tiger. That made me laugh.
Yeah. Our brain is smart that way. It eventually realizes.
I guess a lot of these things have come from our ancient sort of growing up on the Serengeti or somewhere like that. And we just haven't adapted quickly enough to, modern world has just come around so quickly that we haven't kind of adapted. Is that right?
That's exactly what has happened. Our fight or flight response has not developed very much since the days when we were in the desert. It really just hasn't. So our other parts of our brain have developed faster than our ability to detect a true threat from, I can't have the blue cup, or even as an adult, like we think things are the worst thing in the world. If my child doesn't pick up their clothes right now off the floor, it is the worst thing in the world. Our brain hasn't developed very much to distinguish.
So I had a look on your website before our call, and there's some things that you're often asked to speak about. And some of these things, like big parent issues, big parent problems that sound like amazing solutions that you have. So this might be kind of a very difficult problem that I'm asking you to solve in the next sort of few minutes or something. But the first one is get your kids to listen without yelling or nagging.
Yeah. There's actually a very simple way to do that. It's simple, it's not easy. But the way you get your kids to listen without nagging or yelling is to understand why they're not listening to begin with. That's the solution. We assume, I'm going to connect it actually to what we've been talking about so far. We assume that the reason kids don't listen is because they're lazy. It's because they're bad. It's because they don't feel like it. And you know what happens when we make that assumption is we go into fight or flight. We can no longer access our prefrontal cortex. So we're thinking my child is lazy. We think, threat, this is horrible. And then we start yelling at our kids, or we start punishing them to try to make them feel bad. but that doesn't address the reason they're not doing what we ask. So there are basically two main reasons kids don't do what we ask. Either they're in yuck, you know about yuck already, I've talked about it, or they're missing executive functioning skills, which almost all children are missing executive functioning skills. So actually the ability to like clean up requires multiple executive functioning skills. It requires task initiation. It requires the ability to persist when a task is boring. These are executive functioning skills. So when there are firm boundaries and kids have mastered executive functioning skills, which we can teach them, and they're not in yuck, they do whatever we ask. So that was a 60-minute talk in 3 minutes. How was that?
Thank you. It was amazing. I am interested in executive function skills though, because I haven't heard anything about that. Do you mind elaborating?
I would love to elaborate because this is so important when it comes to discipline. So executive functioning skills are the skills that allow us to plan and execute responsible behavior, or really any behavior. But when it comes to parents, they want to get kids to listen. The executive functioning skills lie in that prefrontal cortex. So they don't fully develop until the mid-20s, but they include things like I said before, task initiation. So the ability to start a task. This is why we may say to our kids, go play. And they have like 15 toys there, but they don't start playing with any of them, because to start a task actually takes some skill. Then the other one I already mentioned is the ability to persist when something is monotonous. Especially these days, our brains are wired to look for the most novel, most interesting things. So if you say to your child, clean your room. So they may start to clean, but then they see a toy on the floor, or an older child may see, a game or something, whatever it is. They see something and their brain is literally distracted by that novel or more interesting thing. So they get distracted and focus on that. And the ability to not allow that to happen and then come back to the task at hand is very mature. And most kids and most adults have not mastered that. So those are examples of executive functioning skills.
Yeah, I was going to say most adults haven't got that one either.
Exactly.
Makes me think of some kind of analogy that I'm not going to be able to bring to hand, but is what you're saying essentially that when we're asking them to do certain things, like certain tasks, they're actually not physically capable to do them?
It's interesting because they are physically capable, and that's why we get so frustrated. A 2-year-old can pick up their toys and put them in a bin. They're not cognitively able to do it. So their executive functioning skills haven't they haven't mastered these skills yet. So that's where our frustration is. Like, they can do it. They've done it before. I've seen them clean their room. Why aren't they doing it now? So I always ask 3 questions. Do they know they have to? Have your boundaries been firm? Or have you just kind of like said, clean your room and then you walk away? Do they have they mastered the skills, or are they in yuck? So just because they've been physically able to do it before doesn't mean they're going to do it now.
So one of those 3
That's really
things.
Interesting.
Yeah. Yep. It's like
All 3 of
98%
them.
of the time, it's one of those 3 things.
All 3 of them, yeah.
Or all 3.
No more drama. Taming tantrums and strong emotions.
Yes.
I mean, that sort of touches on what we've previously spoken about, but is there anything you'd like to add?
No, I would just say my big takeaway from that talk that I do is that when you see a big emotion, a negative behavior, a negative attitude, very simply, it's a sign that someone's yuck is bigger than their coping skills. That's it. So you tell a child, no, you can't go to your friend's house because you didn't do your homework. They have a lot of yuck and not a lot of coping skills. So what you see in their drama, in their behavior, in their disrespect, in their shutting down, whatever they're doing, their yuck is big, coping skills are not. So they don't have the ability to say, I'm really disappointed that I can't go to my friend's house. I was looking forward to, they can't do that. You just see their yuck spewing.
Are there any sort of, if we accept that their yuck has to come down the other side and they have to keep calm, is there anything that we can do once they are calm to try and help them avoid that yuck? Because I guess it's like an emotional hijack. So is there a way of stopping that in the future, or sort of, is there a good time for this?
Absolutely. And that's actually most of what I teach parents. I teach parents about the yuck curve so you're aware, but then I say, okay, let's not try to do all this in the moment. Let's do it outside of the moment. So what we ultimately want to do is foster resilience in children. And that's mostly what I teach. So fostering resilience in children, which may be another one of the things you're going to ask me about because I talk about it a lot. I will say fostering resilience starts with us as parents. We have to emotionally regulate because we can teach our kids all the tools in the world. And this is actually why I stopped being a therapist and became a parenting expert, because I was helping kids. I was giving them the tools and then sending them home, and parents were unintentionally creating an environment where kids couldn't use those tools. So starts with us. Because if we give kids tools, you'll understand this because I've talked about this already. We give kids tools. Well, the access to the tools is in the prefrontal cortex. But if they sense that we're angry, they sense that we're anxious or judgmental, they can't access their prefrontal cortex because they're in yuck. So starts with us. Then we start to teach them tools for resilience. So I'll just give you a couple of examples. I teach many, but we can actually teach kids flexible thinking skills, so that if their blue shirt is in the washing machine, they don't see that as a threat anymore. Or if their sister took their toy from them, or their brother, played loud music and wouldn't stop, they don't see that as a threat anymore. So flexible thinking skills. And then ultimately, we also teach them coping skills. How do you, when you are on the curve, how do you cope in a way that you're not turning your yuck out or turning it in or numbing it, as the case may be? So those are examples of how we foster resilience. And we do all that outside of the moment.
So flexible thinking skills,
Yeah.
I mean, what would be an example of how that would work?
So I love teaching flexible thinking skills because especially until your kids are about 7, 8, 9, it can be really fun. Then, when they get that age, they don't want fun anymore. But what I say about flexible thinking skills is you can build it sort of into a game. So one example is, let's say you're sitting with your child and you see a lamp in the room and you say, hey, what do you use a lamp for? And they'll say, for a light. And you say, okay, let's see if we can, how many things we can come up with that you can use a lamp for that has nothing to do with light. And you sort of make it a game, like how many ideas can we come up with? Or another one would be, maybe for the next 30 minutes, we're going to do things differently. We're going to call each other by our middle names. We're going to just do things differently. And then eventually I have parents start to teach kids to connect this to a real life situation. So, hey, you're really good at that game that we play where we look for different ways to use this. Can you think about how you might do this when your brother is yelling at you? Now, we have to have a good relationship with our kids for them to be open to talk about that. But that's where we get, and we start to show them how they can think more flexibly when things don't go their way. And for big emotion children, this is a huge skill that they're missing. That's why their emotions, when things don't go the way they imagine in their mind, they don't have flexible thinking. That's when you see the big emotions.
I think that's a really, really fantastic game and a really great concept. I like it. I can imagine if there's a time, because all parents sometimes hear their children say, I'm bored, there's nothing to do, when they've got so many more things to do than we ever did at our age, but yeah, I'm so bored. They do, they're on their phones and I'm bored. That's a great game just to pass some time and make it a bit more fun and have that interaction as well. But I love the idea that then you can take that further down the road and potentially sort of use it as a way of getting them to maybe come down the yuck a little bit faster.
Or even not go on it to begin with.
Or not go on it.
Yeah, which it really does do. And that's, for me as a parent, that's a little bit easier for my kids not to go on the yuck curve, but you can't always prevent it, so.
Do you use that in, because this particular topic is important to me, and I think, Jake, that you've referenced this before, is raising siblings who get along.
Yeah. So in this one, I talk a little bit about why siblings don't get along again. And one of you, I don't even remember which one of you said this in the beginning, but we have to go under behavior. So I always look at why don't siblings get along? And the reason siblings don't get along, there are generally 3 reasons. One of them is that one or both are in yuck and they're taking it out on each other. So, siblings are such easy targets. Even if one child is just at school and they had a bad day, sibling is right there. So that's a very major reason they just take out their yuck, even if it's not because their sibling did something. Second reason is, going back to Jake, what you just said, they're bored. It's so common that siblings are just mean. Like if one sibling is making loud noises and the other one says stop, and they say, no, I'm not going to stop. It's because the one who's making loud noises is bored. That's why they do that to begin with. They're actually trying to engage their brain. So boredom is the second reason. So we have yuck, boredom. And the third reason I really think is an issue is that they don't actually know how to solve problems. They don't have conflict resolution skills. So if one is being loud and the other one is saying stop, and the loud one says, I'm not going to stop, how do they resolve that? They have no idea except to argue and fight. So those are the main reasons for sibling issues.
You do
Some
any?
of them sound quite familiar. Sorry.
No, go ahead, because we have used the example before, haven't we, of siblings not getting along. But I wanted to ask about one thing, which I am interested in. I don't know whether it's in the, should we say, the clinical literature, or whether you even use that term, but sibling rivalry and the deeper meaning behind those things. Is it something that you're aware of?
You mean like what causes rivalry?
Yeah.
Yeah, my perspective is that rivalry comes from it's from the need to know we matter. So as individuals, we need to know we belong. Everyone knows that. We're social creatures. We need to know we belong. But there's another need that we all have, and that's the need to know we matter. Even if we belong in our family, do people get us? Do people understand us? Do I matter as much as other people? And we can remember this when we were kids, even if we were only children, like in a classroom, we all wanted someone to recognize us as an individual. And so sibling rivalry is often about, like, let me give you an example. If a child says, you gave him a bigger piece of the cookie, it's not actually the cookie that they're worried about. It's do you like him better? Do you think he matters more? Because, I mean, maybe they like the cookie, but generally it's, do I matter as much as my brother or sister? So the way I talk about how you resolve this is to say to the child who says he has more cookies, saying, hey, are you telling me you want more cookie? So you always bring it back to them and say, what do you need right now? I see you in front of me right now. What is it that you need? And generally, when we really see our children as individuals, that's why when they're together a lot, they fight more. But when they're apart and they have their own individual lives, they fight less. They're really, rivalry, from my perspective, is really about the fight to know I matter.
Interesting. You referenced this, I think, in this episode, and we've talked about it many times on the podcast, is around electronics, devices. Maybe, do you often get asked about social media as well? And have you got any advice that you would share there?
Yeah, I do speak about social media, and especially from a like, how do we get our kids off of, because I specialize in discipline and big emotions. So it's mostly how do I get kids off of it? But I also talk about social media and self-esteem, because my area of clinical expertise and interest is self-esteem and resilience. So is there a particular aspect of social media that you'd want me to mention?
You've asked about this, Jake, and I think you've got more experience with dealing with this. Is there something, a main problem that you see with social?
Yeah, well, there are a few things really about it. The first thing is, most of the time when I speak to my daughters, they're like this the whole time, and I've heard it said that it's not possible to multitask. In fact, your brain is flitting between one thing and the other really quickly. Mm-hmm. So trying to ensure that my kids are present and in the room, even if they're watching a TV show, if we're watching a TV show together or whatever it is, it just always seems to be they're communicating with their friends on social media. And so to say it's an addiction is definitely an understatement. It definitely is. And that's the first thing. So they're not present, and they don't have as much, I mean, they're not focused really on interactive as much as, you know, I would prefer them to be. And I kind of worry if that makes them less able to sort of be creative and come up with games and free thinking ideas. So that's one side, and the second side is obviously they're communicating with their friends, and who knows what they're doing or saying. And certainly one of my daughters last year, it turns out that her friend group became a little bit toxic, and you know, we were unaware of this. We could see that she was getting more and more distressed and unhappy, but it took a bit of a crisis at school before we came to realize what the reason was, and before she opened up. And because before that, oh no, I'm fine, everything's fine, no, you know, that was our communication. So social media, I think, is, yeah, it's a multifaceted question really. It's got lots of things. So first of all, addictive side of it. And I guess the second thing is, how do we regulate it with their friends, etc.
Gotcha. Okay. So I will tell you, let's talk about the addiction piece. One of the things that you're fighting against, which is why it's so hard to break that away from them, is the phone gives them, it meets their many of their needs. So I talked a little bit before about their need for engagement. So they're used to, especially again, the way our kids grew up with these screens when they were young that were changing within milliseconds. Even if it was an educational game, it was changing and changing. So now their brains are wired for more and more stimulation and engagement. And so the screen provides that. Then when you talk about social media, we have an emotional need for connection, especially true during, I don't know how old your daughters are. How old are your daughters?
Yeah. Mine are 16 and just about to come up to 14.
Yeah. At that age, connection is one of their primary goals because they're starting to do what we call individuating and figuring out who they are and their place in the world outside of the family. So you're also dealing with their brain saying, I have to connect with my friends. The other thing you're dealing with is the stress and potential threat if they disconnect from their friends. So it's not just I want to connect, but it's if I disconnect, there's going to be some sort of catastrophic result. So you're fighting against the engagement, the connection, and the fear of what will happen if they disengage. And that's why it's like sucking them in. So you come along, you're not that, I mean, no offense, because you seem engaging to me, but to your daughters, you might not be that engaging. And then also you're not able to alleviate the stress of what might happen if they disconnect. So that's why they're so attracted to that. So what I teach very briefly because I used to be a therapist for teens, especially teenage girls, is that we have to sort of understand what their needs are that are being met, and we have to find other ways to meet them. So this leads to the second question, which is how do we sort of navigate that? It is easier, and you probably know this, it's easier to start before they get their devices, but it doesn't mean you can't do it afterwards. But really creating rules in the house about how much you will monitor. And I'm a believer that we can't monitor everything. They're going to be smarter than we are. But I met a lot of teens who said, my parents never, ever, ever check. So I think we sort of need to check just so they know that we are. Not that I think we're going to find everything, because we won't. There were Finstagram accounts way before we knew what Finsta was. I don't know if you know that fake Instagram account. They knew that before we did, but we need to monitor, and we need to allow them to, we need to make these rules that work for our family. And I'm a big believer when you're working with teens that rules are created together. I have a strategy I call joint problem solving, where you're actually creating the rules and the consequences with your teen, with a lot of respect towards them and how hard it is for them to get off. A lot of respect, and then giving them some sense of control as well, because teens will rebel if they don't have respect and control. So that was a long answer. I hope it covered a little bit of what you were asking about.
Wow, I think that was an excellent answer, really much better than I could have possibly have imagined. Yeah, thank you.
Sure.
I think you've done an amazing job of answering the various questions I fired at you. So I really appreciate the expertise, and I love talking to educated people like yourself. If people want to know more, which I'm sure they will, or they should, where do they find you?
So I have a podcast. It's called Your Parenting Long Game. And my first season, which is about 110 episodes, was really about discipline. And I did talk about big emotions a little bit, but discipline and why kids do what they do. Now in my second season, I'm talking more about big emotions. So my podcast, again, Your Parenting Long Game. I have a website, rachel-bailey.com. I also have a free video series that I will give access to all your listeners to, that really talks about raising kids with big emotions and why some of the things we've tried in the past don't tend to work. So I'll give you a link to that as well.
Sounds like we
Amazing.
need to get on that, Jake.
Yeah, for sure. Definitely.
Have you got any closing thoughts or anything you'd like to conclude?
Yeah, I would say that there was a lot of information we talked about today. There's a lot that goes into parenting. And I think the first thing that we need to think about is that we don't need to know it all. We don't need to have it all. I think as parents, we need to give ourselves a little bit of a break, take one step at a time, do the best we can, and not live in a place of fear that if I don't know this and I don't know this, I'm going to mess up my child. It's actually not true. I would say we need to give ourselves a little grace. That's what I would close with.
Lovely close. Rachel, Jake, thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you.